Well, hello, EXED 605 students. What follows is an orientation to Module 2 in EXED 605. As you can see, we're on the Canvas page, and there are two items in Module 2. The first is, well, the second actually, is Education Week version 2. This is very straightforward, similar to last week. You're to go in and take a look at the articles that are posted, click on the links, and read two that you're interested in. There are 3 this week. I believe last week there were 4. So you're only required to read 2 and then post your discussion board responses. The more important document in Module 2 is this. It's the IES Special Education Funding Opportunities document. So if we click on that, and then we go ahead up here and just click on that to create an external link or an external page. This is the mother lode of funding for education. It's the Institute of Education Sciences, and this is the major funding stream for education research in the United States. And this particular list of topics, which are the basis for funding and grant programs, have to do with special education. So why are we looking at this? Well, one reason is because issues and trends tend to go where the money is. And this is where the money is. So there are 11 topics that are the basis for grant-funded programs through IES. And here they are: autism spectrum disorders, cognition and student learning in special education, families, math and science education, reading and writing, and finally, transition outcomes for secondary students with disabilities, technology, policy, and finance. You can read them on your own. So the first question that I'm going to ask you to answer for your final project, and this will be the basis for your final project, this document, is what do these 11 topics that are funded here, these grant programs, say about current issues and trends in special education? So just by looking at the list of titles, for example, we can see that autism is listed as its own funding opportunity. Well, isn't it interesting that we don't have the same for learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities or emotional behavioral disorders? Autism has its own funding stream. So what does that say about the way we view autism in special education today? Well, it's a hot issue. It's a hot topic. And one of the reasons it's hot is because of the dramatic rise in the incidence of students identified as having autism spectrum disorder in the last few years. So what we do is we click on one of these, and we'll click on autism, and it gives you a very brief description of what the competition is about for 12. So here's the big document that we're interested in, and this is the same document regardless of which one of the different topics you clicked on previously, because it covers all of them. So this is the request for applications. And there are 3 sections in this document that are relevant for your assignment that's due the last week of the course. June 27th is the final, that's when it's due. So it includes some generic stuff on the whole proposal submission process, which is not relevant. But if we go to the table of contents, these are the sections that I'm going to ask you to look at carefully. First of all, the general requirements section, which is only 2 pages. We'll take a look at that. So you're required to look at those 2 pages. And then, more importantly, Part 2 and Part 3. So Part 2 and Part 3 describes the 11 topics in more detail. And, well, we'll get to the goals in a minute. For some reason, it's not letting me go further down. But Part 2 is important. And then Part 3 are the goals associated with these different topics. And we're going to talk about those in a minute. So you can submit proposals, identify projects under each one of these topics related to either exploration, innovation, efficacy, effectiveness, and measurement, and we'll talk a little bit about what those that I mentioned earlier. And in looking through this, you might want to pay attention to some of the language, because that's part of the question I'm going to ask you to address. So first of all, for all of these competitions, IES is interested in outcomes. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? They're not interested in necessarily the causes of the disability. They're more interested in the educational outcomes. Well, that defines the issue in a very specific way. They're looking at these different age groups in general. They're also looking at authentic education settings. So IES is not interested in funding projects that are developed in a lab type situation where the results wouldn't generalize to authentic classroom situations. So that's important to note. We start with the actual detailed descriptions of each of the topics. So this is the first one, autism spectrum disorders. And it goes on to talk about how now 1 in 68 children are identified as having autism spectrum disorder. Well, what's interesting about that? Well, what's interesting about it is that it's gone up dramatically in the last few years. So the important thing here is to look through these and from the language, from the way the issues are being presented, try to come up with some themes that you would say characterize how IES presents these funding opportunities.